Hello, and welcome to our second episode of the Get Scrappy video series here on Build It, Ship It. And today we've got Pat, Pat, we know each other only through Twitter up until this meeting. It's so nice to meet you in a virtual person kind of way here.
Yeah, great to meet you too, John. Certainly had a lot of conversations in the Twitterverse, and so great to actually talk live for the first time. I'm a product manager currently at Zillow. I just started at Zillow. Before that, I was at Capital One, and then kind of earlier in my career, I was a Navy officer. I was a civil engineer corps officer in the Navy, doing very different type of engineering than I'm doing now. But kind of been through quite a transition to get to this point, just as I started learning more and more, started having conversations in product Twitter, which for anybody out there, if you haven't checked out product Twitter, I recommend it. Lots of good content, information, and conversations. So just kind of learning along the way and working on becoming a better product leader.
I'm glad you mentioned product Twitter because you are one of the few people. I'm not just saying that because you're here. I'm not just saying this because you're here. You're one of the few people that when I see your tweets, they're really just chock full of value and they have real substance behind them. So truly, you're one of the first people I thought of when we launched this series. No pressure or anything, but and the whole point of this Get Scrappy series is how can we give people actionable advice as product leaders to get out and be more successful with some of this advice. So you're the perfect person to join us today. And thank you for your service. I should make sure I don't forget to say that.
No, absolutely.
It's 4th of July weekend too. So it's all coming together here, but cool. So Pat, you told me some of the more practical advice you have, especially as a product leader and trying to rally folks, was around strategy. Could you talk a little bit more about that and some of your tips and tricks?
Yeah. So when I joined my last team, the one I just left, we had no roadmap. The position that I was filling had been gapped for a couple months. Someone was sort of hot seating it. An analyst was hot seating it. They kind of knew how to run a team a little bit day to day, but that was kind of it because their main work was more like business on the business analytical side of things. And so I came in and they didn't really have anything to work on. And what I found out pretty quickly once we got our feet under ourselves and started building out the roadmap is we didn't know where we were going. Like there was no why. Like, why is this next thing on the roadmap? Why are we doing it? And that's when it became pretty clear that, we needed a vision, we needed a strategy, we needed to figure out why we were doing the things we were doing and that those things made the most sense. And so it all kind of cascaded from there. And so that's when we took the time to establish our product vision. Then we established what our strategy was. And then when it came time to build the roadmap and prioritize, it was so easy. Like road mapping, I feel like road mapping is something so many teams labor over. But if you do that upfront work, which is hard, like figuring out a really good vision and a strategy that has a lot of buy-in and alignment within your org. But if you do those two parts, the roadmap, I feel like, is so much easier. And that for the next 2 years in that role, it just paid dividends. Every time we went to our VP of product, like she kind of knew what we were doing already. And so it was just kind of an update. She might ask some questions about prioritization. And of course, things change, like, every couple months, something new comes up and we have to factor that in. But it just made those conversations a lot easier. And so that was kind of the realization that I had early on in that role. And it just proved itself over and over. And so that's become, kind of a core thing that I'm always reminded of, the importance of that, because I've just seen it play out firsthand.
Yeah, and I think it's more common than obviously than it should be, but I've seen it in places that I've been too, and that why just isn't understood by everyone. Maybe everyone's not aligned, but maybe it's folks have different whys or different ideas of what the strategy or vision should be, which could also be problematic. But in your case, there was nothing there, it seemed like, and you didn't fill that hole. The other challenging thing you tell me, but I imagine it's hard when there's the hole of a strategy or the gap, because there's an immediate need to fill it, right? And some companies will hire consulting and, do a bunch of research, which is all good and really should do. But did you feel a little bit of urgency to kind of fill that hole with something that people could rally around?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely like when you're at the product team level, you got to feed the tech beast, as they say.
Yes.
You got to have shovel ready work for the engineers to ship. And it's definitely like a challenging conversation when you go to leadership and you say like, hey, we need to slow down so that we can speed up later. I think it's all in how you approach those conversations and the level of trust that your leadership puts in you, which you can build over time. But that was certainly like a tricky balance up front, is like there was kind of some things that the team had been wanting to do that we kind of, went ahead and put out there. Some of it never ended up sticking around. So that transition period was hard. But what we tried to do is really like prioritize. Not only do you have to prioritize what you're going to ship, but we're also prioritizing our time. And so we really tried to prioritize taking the time to figure out the why, like you were pointing out, and the and what we were going to do to achieve that why, or what the biggest opportunities were that would feed into that why. And then from there, it just kind of snowballed.
So this is really interesting. And I'm trying to think, right? If someone's watching this video and saying, hey, I feel rudderless, I don't know what the why is. What's the first step you can take as maybe an individual contributor and understanding what that why is, or maybe someone, it sounds like you were in this position, who's responsible for coming up with the why. Let's start with the first one though. For the individual contributor, what's the best way to uncover what that why should be? Other than just, I guess, asking your boss, right? And trying to figure out where it lives.
Yeah. So what I did is the first thing I did when I joined the team is I met with all of our engineers one-on-one. And the first thing was like, hey, show me what you're working on. So the first conversation was actually more like interpersonal, getting to know them, which I think is like really important.
Sure.
And then after that, I had another follow-up and it was like, show me what you're working on. And so I think just developing a relationship with the engineers, they're the ones working on the product every single day and oftentimes know it really well. So that's where I always start, because a lot of times they have that ground level visibility that nobody else has. And so that's one part I start to figure out like how the product's working, what gaps are they seeing, not only from a developer perspective, but just from a product perspective, because they're the ones responding to bugs, responding to fire drills. They're just going to know like what the historical sort of issues are there. And then the other aspect that I spent time on was looking at existing customer research. So I don't know how every company, if they have something like this or not, but at Capital One, they had a repository where every time a customer research study was done, they stored it in this repo and you could search it for different decks and readouts. And so some of it is a little bit old, but customers for the most part don't change. Like the things that they're looking for don't change. And so most of the stuff I looked at the time was maybe 2-3 years old, but it seemed all pretty relevant. I worked on the CreditWise app, which is our credit score tracking tool at Capital One. So people trying to improve their credit score, that's pretty, consistent type of problem. And the details don't change too much. And so I read all of those to understand what is it that what are the problems they're having? And then we had some research on what they thought about CreditWise and then what they thought about Credit Karma, which is our biggest competitor. And so that really laid the foundation for not only what customers did and didn't like about our product, but what they liked and didn't like about competitors. And then overall, broadly, like what is getting in the mind and getting into the shoes of the customer, like just reading and digesting all of that information was super, super foundational, and just like putting yourself in the shoes of the customer so that you can get a sense of who they are. And I think that's really, really important, because and I'll speak to this example specifically. CreditWise, Credit Karma, their number one customer segment are people who are trying to improve their credit. Mm-hmm. Frankly, most people work at Capital One have good credit scores, but a lot of Americans don't. And so you can get into this product bias trap that I think a lot of product managers get in, where they think all their customers are like them, and so when we think about CreditWise, like you might look at something and be like, that won't work, but that's your own bias at play. right? You have to really I mean, that's why they call it empathy interviews. You really have to empathize with your customers and what's the right thing for them, and what's going to resonate with them most. And so that foundational like research played a huge role in like understanding what is actually the right thing for our customers, so that you can get your mind in that framework, in that framing, as you continue to move forward and start actually developing your strategy.
This is great. And one of my favorite topics, probably go a couple hours on this. But I'm curious, just to move things along. So you've done this research, you understand what the team's working on, customer needs. And I love that. I love how you put that, right? Wearing the shoes of the customer? My first product boss, I was actually helping out a product management team, and I said, well, what's product management exactly? And she said, it's wearing the hat of the customer. So that was, and I still think about that definition. But assuming that you can take the customer research, the work that's in flight, kind of synthesize that a bit and come up with a strategy or a vision, at least for, the short term, at least for what the team should be working on. Did you check that? Did you work that at all around the office to make sure that it was on point and clear it of any bias that you might have still?
Yeah, and what you're alluding to is like the most important part of the process that I didn't even realize at the time. So once we did that research, I got some time with our analysts, because just because 2 or 3 or 10 customers say there's a problem doesn't mean there's actually one at scale. Right. And so you've got to validate that like there wasn't a bias in the research or something like that. So we spent some time saying, hey, I'm kind of seeing these like 5 to 10 problems. Can you guys help me like validate this in the data to make sure these are actually like problems at scale? And so that was one thing we did. And so once that was all done, we kind of identified, hey, here's some like lagging issues that we know that we've made progress on and are resonating with our customers. There's usually like, if your product has product market fit, you've probably got some stuff working, and that those core features or those core opportunities that you're going after, there's probably some value in staying in that space to some degree. And then you've got to figure out what is next. What are like the big bets that we want to do? And so that's where some of that more customer research came in. Some of the analysis started showing us things that we hadn't looked into. And so as we kind of drafted that up, I got a deck, and I will say, like, there's a lot of this, like, I don't know, BS on Twitter that's like, get your team in a room and figure out the strategy. I don't subscribe to that at all, quite frankly. I feel like you got to have something for them to look at, something for them to react to. Yeah. And so as I was putting this together, that's when I brought in the engineers, I brought in our analysts more, I brought in our designer and said, hey guys, like, I've been touching base with a bunch of you over the past couple of weeks, but kind of here's what I'm putting together. And that's where we started having sessions of talking through things and having those conversations. And that was like the beginning stages of building that alignment. And those conversations resulted in what I would say is like an 80% deck. So we had those conversations that kind of threw together some like, quick docs just to have those conversations. And then I took that away and I built like a deck that was maybe 80%, what I thought was like probably 80% good. And that was at that point, teams aligned, like engineers, analysts, designers. But when you're on a product team, there's a lot of other product teams you work with, and there's just natural interconnectivity and alignment that you need to get, around your team, and you need to get other teams bought in on what you're trying to do so that when you need their support, they're already bought in. And so that's when I went on, I guess you call it like a sales tour. Like I took that deck to all like the product directors, like in our org. And I was like, hey, what do you guys think of this? Like, not only from a deck perspective, because I wanted some help with storytelling, but also like the content, more importantly, what do you guys think about it? And that's where they could immediately start thinking how our team impacted theirs, how their team could help us. And so there was a lot of tangible benefits, but sort of the additional benefit is they're getting bought in on what we're trying to do and getting excited about, hey, this team's got some momentum. They're figuring out what they want to do. Like that mental aspect, I did not expect, but turned out to be so much more important than anything else, is that they were like excited and they were bought in on what we were doing. And of course they had like, hey, can we work this in? Or, hey, we actually tried that 3 years ago. I don't know if I would go after that, and just all of that came together in just like a really good sort of group of evangelists, I guess, of what we were trying to do, because they all had a piece in it. Not
So now
only at
you're
the
not the
team
only
level.
one carrying the flag, right?
Right,
You're all
right,
carrying it together.
right. And so when you go to
Important.
present to the VP of product and she says, "Hey, director Mike, what do you think?" He's like, "Oh yeah, we chat about this. I'm totally on board. We made a few changes." It just like eliminates all of that. And you really just get to focus on the VP at that point. And a lot of times that senior leader, if you've got bought in from everybody else, you're unlikely to get, a major reject from them. And so that that whole process just proved to be so much more powerful than I had expected.
There's a lot in there I love. I love the fact that, rather than start with a whiteboard and say, let's figure this thing out from the ground up, like you said, show up with something that is going to be to some degree wrong, right? And I think
Right.
for me, that was a hard thing to get used to. Maybe it was out of insecurity, maybe it was ego, I don't know. But, I didn't really get excited about showing up to a meeting and saying like, I can't wait to be wrong today, probably 5 or 6 times. Until, you grow up a little bit and you realize, oh no, this is actually progress. And this is going to get everyone rallied around an idea that's ours, not mine. And so I love the fact that you go in there with something, right? And I think that is very tactical and really sound advice. And the other thing you said, which I've been a proponent of, I've written a little bit about it too, is just get like that spectrum of agreement, which is, are people just saying, giving you their consent? Are people saying like, I'll support it if you need help? Or are people really excited and inspired by it? And I think you used the word excited by it, right? And getting Mike, the other director to be kind of singing the same hymnal, that's critical. So I'm glad you mentioned that too. So last question I have for you now, kind of looking at the whole journey of this from creating it to getting alignment, I find, maybe you can disagree with this because maybe it's just in my experiences, but there are times where that strategy starts to shift a little bit or maybe evaporate, or more likely folks start to hone in more on the roadmap than that North Star, right? We need to get this thing out by this date, and you forget about that why, or some do anyway. Have you come across any tips, tricks that you can share with people on how to keep that message top of mind for the team?
That is so important, particularly at the senior leadership levels, because they're dealing with 10, 15, 20 product teams, and they're hearing about a million different things. Plus, if they're execs, they're talking to other execs about other things that are tangentially related. And if you are not constantly sort of finding ways to keep updates out there that are not too burdensome and that maybe are asynchronous, like people are going to forget kind of from their mind, like what you're working on. And so I found, particularly in large organizations, finding ways to like keep updates out there is really important. And the other thing you pointed out is like things do change.
Yeah.
And so what we started doing is a quarterly update. We did a couple things actually. We did a monthly stakeholder update. So once a month, I would put together a deck and we would invite everybody in CreditWise, which is my team, and all of the business teams that we partnered with within Capital One. So you're talking probably 150 people on the invite.
Wow.
Usually like 30 to 60 showed up because people have, it's just kind of a FYI type meeting. So they don't have to come. And it's just a quick deck. It was usually like 2 or 3 feature updates or 2 or 3 opportunity updates, roadmap updates, just general updates that I would walk through in like 20 minutes or so. And I would bring in other people from the team if I thought they were better suited to talk about a topic. And then we allowed everybody in the audience to ask questions, and I send out the deck afterwards. So that always ensured, like, even if you didn't make the meeting, you're getting a deck from me once a month with like, here's kind of what's going on. The second thing is within the team internally, and to your point of how do we make sure we're aligned to like the North Star and like, continuing to work on, whatever it is we decided the strategy was, is we typically, what we did initially, and this changed over time, is we had, when I first laid out the strategy, we had 4 pillars. Each one of those pillars was a swim lane on the roadmap. So you never forgot what those pillars were. Our overarching objective was at the top of the roadmap. Yep. And then each swim lane was a pillar, and I won't repeat them because it doesn't mean anything to anybody here, but there was 4 swim lanes, and then features were on the kind of the now or next level, and then opportunities were in that later section, opportunities that we hadn't figured out what that feature is going to be yet. And so everybody could always see like how things were laddering all the way back up. And that was kind of where we started. Over time, our organization switched to OKRs and like really rigid OKR implementation. And so we had already been doing OKRs, but we hadn't quite fit them into the roadmap. And so kind of where our org eventually landed was that objective at the top, but each swim lane was a key result. And so you could see things lining up to key results, which is again fine. I think the overarching thing is, that vision and then your OKRs that fall from there, like having those really crystallized and available and reviewing those. We reviewed all of this quarterly with our team. And then, obviously I'm talking to the engineers every day. So like these roadmap updates come up more frequently than that. But in terms of like a formal roadmap update, that was once a quarter. You could just see it. If you're looking at a roadmap, that's where you're going to see everything. And so I think, finding ways to keep it streamlined, keep it simple, and put it in an artifact that people reference a lot was kind of what worked for us.
That's excellent. I love it. I love the framework too, where the repetition of seeing the same, it might, like you said, it'll change over time, but at least for some period of time, you're seeing those same themes and those same objectives tied to the overarching vision. Well, Pat, this is great. And I think what I love about the advice that you're giving folks today is it scales, right? I mean, I think you can employ parts, maybe all of this as a chief product officer or as someone who might just own, a feature within a product. I think it all counts. So really appreciate you sharing your experiences and some of the advice that you have. Anything you wanted to plug before we part here?
I have three last things. The first one is, if you are a product leader and you have like PMs reporting to you, please like empower them to be able to do this. I would not have been able to learn this lesson myself if I wasn't empowered to do it, Yes. So like if you're hiring someone, hopefully you've got the trust in them to do the job. And so I think sometimes there's this natural tendency, and in its worst form, it's micromanagement. But leaders have a tendency to want to like overmanage things. And I think if you unleash, your people that you hired, presumably you trust, you might be surprised with what they come up with. And so that's the first thing. Second thing is, as you mentioned, I'm on Twitter, Pat the PM, very easy Twitter handle. If you want to check out my content there. And last thing, I do have a podcast. It's called Vet Coach Transition Tips. It's just vetcoachtransitiontips.com. I don't update it weekly or monthly. It's kind of ad hoc, but for any veterans who are out there, there's not a ton of us in product, but there are some. I talk about all things transitioning from active duty into the private workforce and kind of the lessons I've learned, the lessons my friends have learned, and what's worked for me and what hasn't. To kind of provide just like a general roadmap, if you will, of, tips and tricks and things I've learned along the way to make that transition more successful. So yeah, that's it.
That's great. So if you know anyone, it's not just for product, right? So anyone would
all veterans. Yep.
Gain from it. So if you know someone in the military
and non-veterans too. I mean, it's just general, advice. There is a slight veteran twist to it. And like an example of that is stupid things veterans do in interviews. Like one that comes to mind is they cuss in interviews just for whatever reason. The culture in the military is, has some loose language involved and people get too comfortable and they cuss in it. It's like stupid things like that we talk about that like your average person might not even think of, but it's general advice. But yeah, for all veterans getting out, trying to figure out where to get started and what to expect.
Great. Pat, thanks so much for being part of this.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Happy 4th of July.
Yeah, you too.